Classical Mythology, CAMS 1103. Here's a trivia question for you. In the key of A flat, what's the dominant? Put it in the contest forum. Enjoy the lecture.
Now you need to know a little bit about the literary context that Ovid is coming into as he finishes his education and decides that maybe he'd like to write some poetry. That context is dominated by poets who are writing in a variety of different meters, and although we don't have very many meters in English, you, I think, know what I mean when I say that poetry is in a certain meter. One of the meters is the famous dactylic hexameter that we were talking about in the Odyssey. And that meter is going to be really important as we move along in this discussion, because dactylic hexameter is the meter of epic. You remember, Andra moyenne pemusa polutropon hos malapola, dump ba-da-dump ba-da-dump, ba-da-dump 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 bum. Anyway, there were several poets who were working in dactylic hexameter, most notably before Ovid's time, Virgil, who writes the famous Aeneid that we're going to be talking a lot about as we go along, above all because the Aeneid is a celebration of Augustus and of what he has done and is doing to Rome. And therefore it presents an enormous target as well as an enormous problem for Ovid. But there's one meter that poets are using that is especially appropriate for a young man who wants to make his name in the poetic world, as well as in the general cultural world of aristocratic Rome. And that meter is called Elegiac Distich, or Elegiac Couplet, or Elegiac by itself. My favorite way to introduce this meter, the Elegiac meter, the Elegiac Couplet, is with something that Coleridge wrote as a way of teaching what this meter was all about, and also describing how this meter seemed to him to work and what it seemed to him to evoke. So his couplet is, "In the hexameter rises the fountain silvery column, in the pentameter A falling in melody back." Now, you have to understand that A here is not I, the word that also means yes, but rather the archaic English A, which means forever. In the pentameter A falling in melody back. Now, if your ear is really attuned to meter, you may have noticed that the second line of the couplet is created simply by taking the first half of a hexameter and then repeating it. So, in the hexameter ri is repeated in the pentameter A, and then you go back to the beginning, in the pentameter A falling in melody back. So the two lines of the couplet are closely related in terms of their metrical structure, and yet different. And that's going to prove crucial as we move on into introducing the metamorphoses, if you can believe it. Now, Elegiac Distich has a long and distinguished history, and it's necessary, if you're really going to understand what's going on with Ovid, to go all the way back to its very beginning and to give you a taste of what Elegiac Distich is like in ancient Greece, hundreds of years before Ovid gets a hold of it. For Ovid, it's the meter of love, because the various poets who are working in it around his time are using this meter, the Elegiac Couplet, specifically as a meter to talk about love. For the Greeks, however, the Elegiac Couplet was above all the meter of mourning. And that's why we use our word elegiac the way we do when we use it. Here's what's probably pound for pound the most famous elegiac passage in all of Western literature. The epitaph for those who died, the famous 300, made immortal most recently by a movie of the same name at Thermopylae. O xein angelein lacedaimonios hotet deida, Gemeta dois genon remasebe tomenoi. Friend, tell the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their commands. Very simple, very beautiful, and very sad. And the Elegiac Couplet had many uses, but the one that was most closely associated with it was this use of mourning. So when, in the spirit of something they had found the Alexandrian poets doing, the Roman poets of the 1st century BCE decided to write love poetry in Elegiac Couplet, there is the feeling that they're mourning the loss of the loved object, the feeling that the object they love is out of reach and they're never going to get it because they're writing in this meter that was originally most closely associated with mourning. Why is that important? Well, because it makes a lot of this 1st century BCE love poetry in elegiac couplets very moony, not to put too fine a point on it, very overwrought with the sadness of not having the beloved. And this kind of poetry is represented first and foremost by 2 poets of the 1st century BCE, Propertius and Tibullus. And if you're in the right mood, the poetry of Propertius and Tibullus can be very evocative and very romantic and very sad and affecting. But if you're in the wrong mood, it just seems really lame. It's full of poems where the poet is longing for the beloved and can't get to the beloved and writes the beloved's name on a tree. That's Propertius. And then there's even, and we know this from secondary sources, there's even a kind of subgenre within these poems of writing poems outside your girlfriend's door because you can't get in to see her. Now, one of the things that characterizes this poetry is that the beloved is always somebody that the lover is not married to. And so there's potential here. Remember that this is happening, this stuff is getting written before Augustus comes along. There's potential here for something subversive if you were to continue this poetry and still keep talking about this adultery thing, which is now under Augustus a crime. So it may be that Ovid is just a kind of mischievous person who sees the potential there. And it's for that reason that he writes his first book of love poetry, the Amores. In its outward form, Ovid's Amores looks very much like the kinds of works that Propertius and Tibullus and other elegiac poets that we've lost were producing. But on the inside, this younger poet, Ovid, is showing that in fact he really doesn't like the way that love poetry has been going. In fact, as we're going to see in the Metamorphoses, he may think that the whole way that love and sex are treated in Rome is just wrong. But be that as it may, we can point immediately to some very important differences between the Amores and the books of love elegy by Propertius and Tibullus. First of all, there's the overall tone, which in the Amores is humorous, kind of making fun of this process of trying to get this beloved woman to whom you're not married and all of the troubles that one goes through and all of the sadnesses. Instead of making it very sad, Ovid makes it funny. And then perhaps more importantly, Propertius has a mistress whom he calls Cynthia, although that's obviously a fake name, a pseudonym for her. Tibullus has a mistress whom he calls Delia, which is similarly obviously a fake name for a real person. Ovid has a mistress whom he calls Corinna, who is obviously not a real person. And just to give you an example of the humorous tone here, one of the most famous of the poems of the Amores is a lament over the hair that Corinna, quote-unquote Corinna, has lost to a curling iron which was too hot. And Ovid really does it up in the style of laments of people like Catullus over a dead sparrow that his girlfriend, whom he calls Lesbia, loved. And Ovid's clearly got his tongue in his cheek, and he's making it clear that he thinks that the kind of love poetry people have been writing is stupid, not to put too fine a point on it. And that will lead us directly onward to the next work he writes, the one that's even more provocative, the one I was talking about earlier, the Ars Amatoria.